I opened the Bible that night like a man opening a letter he never expected to receive. I had heard of Proverbs before the short sayings, the wise lines people quote at graduations and funerals, but I had never read it as a whole. Never sat with it the way you sit, with a voice that might change the shape of your life. I read the first line and felt something like a hand on my shoulder. My son, the words landed in me not as doctrine, but as address, not as a lecture, but as a father speaking to a child he may never hold. Reading Proverbs felt like finding a voice I had been missing. It sounded like the father I never had. Direct, urgent, tender, and unafraid to name danger. The book is not a philosophy text. It is not a collection of abstract ideals. It is a manual written in the language of care. It repeats itself because a father repeats himself. It uses short and sharp images because a father knows a son will forget, unless the warning is simple enough to carry. It uses the phrase, my son, not as a rhetorical flourish, but as a tether, a way to bind wisdom to a life that might otherwise drift. What struck me first was how practical it is. Proverbs does not speak in grand abstractions about virtue. It speaks about speech and silence, about work and sloth, about friends and enemies, about money and reputation. It teaches how to choose companions who sharpen you rather than dull you. It teaches how to speak so your words build rather than destroy. It teaches how to work with your hands and how to avoid the slow poison of laziness. These are not lofty ideals for philosophers. They are survival instructions for a young man learning to stand in the world. But beneath the practical language, there is a deeper current confession. The voice that warns so fiercely is not a voice of moral perfection. It is the voice of a man who has been seduced, who has compromised, who has watched his own heart drift. When Proverbs warns about the immoral woman whose house leads down to death, it does not do so as a distant moral. It does so with the urgency of someone who has seen the road's end. When it warns about the lure of riches and flattering speech, it does so with the knowledge of how quickly a man can begin to trust the wrong things. The warnings read like the aftermath of a fall. I could not read those passages without thinking of Solomon. He is the author who had everything a man could want: wisdom, wealth, power, and yet he wrote as a man who had learned the cost of compromise. He married foreign wives. He built altars to other gods. He let intimacy and alliance become a wedge between himself and the God who had given him wisdom. The seductress in Proverbs is not only a literal danger, she is a symbol of anything that seduces a man away from his center. Lust, comfort, the desire for approval, the hunger for status. Any of these can become the thing a man worships when he is not careful. That is the terrifying clarity of Proverbs. Idolatry is not only carved images on a shelf. Idolatry is the human tendency to let anything take God's place. It is the slow reorientation of the heart toward what promises security and meaning but cannot deliver it. Solomon's life shows how easily a man can trade wisdom for worship of something lesser. He did not fall in a single dramatic moment. He fell in 1,000 small concessions. A softened boundary here, an unchallenged desire there, a compromise that seemed small until it was not. Reading Proverbs, I felt the urgency of a father who had watched his own life erode and wanted to spare his son the same fate. There is a tenderness in the repetition of my son that I had never expected. It is not condescending. It is not distant. It is intimate. It is the voice of someone who knows the world will try to teach you the wrong lessons and wants to give you a better map. The book's repeated refrains, listen, accept instruction, do not be wise in your own eyes, are not commands from a distant moralist. They are the kind of counsel a father gives when he knows he will not be there to enforce it. They are the words you need when you are alone at 2 a.m. and the world's promises sound convincing. As I read, I began to inventory the ways Proverbs speaks to the life of a young man. It teaches discernment in friendship. Avoid the companion who drags you into ruin. Choose the friend who corrects you, who speaks truth even when it hurts. It teaches restraint in speech. A man's words can build or destroy, and the wise man measures his tongue. It teaches the dignity of honest labor. Wealth gained quickly is often lost quickly. Steady work builds a life. It teaches humility. Pride isolates. Humility invites counsel. It teaches the value of a good name. Reputation is the currency that outlasts money. These are not platitudes. They are the scaffolding of a life that can withstand temptation. The warnings about the immoral woman hit me differently than I expected. They are not simply warnings about sex. They are warnings about the kind of intimacy that asks you to surrender your center. The seductress flatters. She promises belonging. She offers a counterfeit intimacy that asks for worship. The pattern is always the same: attraction, rationalization, secrecy, surrender. That surrender is not only sexual, it is spiritual. It is the moment a man begins to worship what he should not. Solomon's language is vivid because he wants his son to see the road before he steps on it. He wants the son to recognize the first step for what it is. The book's warnings about idolatry are equally urgent. Idolatry wears many faces: money, power, reputation, comfort, a relationship that demands more than it gives. Solomon's life shows how quickly a man can begin to trust the wrong things. He wrote about the deceit of riches and the danger of flattering speech because he knew how seductive those things are. He knew that a man can be surrounded by success and still be spiritually bankrupt. That is the cruel irony. The more a man has, the more he can be tempted to make an idol of what he possesses. Reading Proverbs felt like being given a father's voice when I had none. I found myself whispering the lines to myself as if I were trying them on. Choose your friends carefully. Guard your heart. Work with your hands. Value a good name. The words were simple, but they landed with the weight of someone who had paid for the lesson. I realized that Proverbs is not just for kings or scholars. It is for young men who are learning to stand, for fathers who want to leave something that matters, for anyone who wants a map through the small decisions that shape a life. There is a particular kind of love in Proverbs that I had not expected. The love of a father who knows he cannot be there. That knowledge changes everything. It makes the counsel urgent. It makes the repetition necessary. It makes the warnings personal. Solomon's book is an act of love. He could not be with his son in every moment, but he could give him a voice that would speak in those moments. That is the ultimate inheritance. Not land, not gold, but the capacity to choose well. I thought about the father I never met. I thought about the conversations I never had, the corrections I never received, the warnings that might have saved me from mistakes I made alone. There is a grief in that absence, but there is also a strange consolation in finding a voice that fills some of the gap. Proverbs became, for me, a surrogate father. It was a voice that said what a father should say: be careful, be humble, work honestly, guard your heart. Choose friends who sharpen you. Do not be seduced by flattering words. Do not let anything take God's place. The urgency of Proverbs is not fear-mongering. It is realism. It recognizes that life is full of small choices that accumulate into ruin or redemption. It recognizes that a man's heart is vulnerable to seduction and to the slow drift into idolatry. It recognizes that wisdom is not a one-time acquisition, but a daily practice. That is why the book repeats itself. That is why it uses images that stick. That is why it addresses the son directly. It is trying to make the lessons habitual, to make them part of the way a man thinks and moves. If I could give one piece of advice to a young man reading this, it would be this: read Proverbs like a son reads a letter from a father. Wear its warnings like armor. Practice its disciplines until they become instinct. Notice what you worship when no one is watching. Choose friends who will tell you the truth. Work with your hands. Value a good name more than quick gain. Guard your heart against the seductions that promise belonging at the cost of your soul. Humble yourself enough to accept correction. These are not easy things, but they are the things that build a life. Proverbs changed the way I think about inheritance. It taught me that the most durable legacy is not a house or a title, but the ability to choose well. It taught me that a father's last act can be to give his son a voice that will speak when he cannot. It told me that wisdom is an inheritance that outlasts crowns and palaces. And it taught me that every young man should read this book with urgency, because the small choices it warns against are the ones that determine whether a life ends in ruin or in steadiness. I finished the book with a strange mixture of grief and gratitude. Griefs for the father I never had, and for the mistakes I made without counsel. Gratitude for the voice I found in Solomon, a voice that is not perfect, but is honest, a voice that turns regret into instruction, a voice that binds wisdom around the neck of a son who might otherwise walk blind. Proverbs is not a book for the flawless. It is a book for the fallible. It is a book for the young man who wants to be built rather than broken. If you are a young man listening to this, take these words seriously. Read Proverbs as if a father wrote it for you. Let it shape your friendships, your speech, your work, your worship. Wear its warnings. Practice its disciplines. pass it on. The book is a father's voice across generations, and it is one of the most radical acts of love a man can receive.